I think the programs that have been designed by Indigenous people include ones that have a culmination and collaboration between studying on campus in the urban center, but also allowing students to be as close as they can to home, learning from home, doing most of their education from home while doing their degrees at the same time. I think those have proven to be really, really effective because, it's hard to take people away from their community, especially the ones that want to stay in the community, and it's hard to get a commitment from them to carve out 4 years to come and live in an urban center and then move back.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ken Coates. I'm the director of the Indigenous program at Macdonald-Laurier Institute, one of Canada's best think tanks on foreign federal policy. I'm delighted to be joined today by Sheila North, who is a very prominent Indigenous leader and educator and everything else you can imagine from the province of Manitoba. She has a remarkable career. She served for, I believe it was like 7 or 8 years as a Grand Chief of the First Nations in northern Manitoba. And that area, watch your news in the next 3 years. This area is going to become nationally prominent because of the pressures for resource development and other things going on in the area. But Sheila has also worked as I love her title, she calls herself storyteller and journalist, and for the CBC, and did that for a while, and also worked on the International Commission on Missing Persons. But I think right now has a job that's really relevant to our conversation, which is about the role of Indigenous people and the services provided to Indigenous people in Canadian universities. And so she's the executive director of some of the Indigenous external relations at the University of Winnipeg. And if you know anything about the University of Winnipeg, it's in the downtown area of Winnipeg. It has a phenomenal institution-wide commitment to Indigenous collaboration. They've done some terrific work with Indigenous communities, with the downtown organizations that are serving sort of the magnet population, people from all around Manitoba. Oftentimes when they're in difficulty in their lives, will come into Winnipeg. And so dealing with that community is an area where enormous support is needed and provided. And so, Sheila, you find yourself right in the middle of one of the most interesting developments, I think, in Canadian university service to the Indigenous population. So, the conversation today is how is the Canadian university system doing? So you've got a great venue or a chair in which to watch what's going on. So what's your general impression of Canadian universities in terms of serving the Indigenous population?
Right. Well, I'm happy to be here with you, Ken. Thanks for inviting me. And just a quick correction, I served 3 years as the MKO Grand Chief in Northern Manitoba and was very happy to do so. But in relation to this conversation, yeah, I think universities have a unique role in the rebuilding and enhancing of Indigenous communities and people in our lives. The late Murray Sinclair Bunn, talked about education as, the new buffalo, and education got us in this mess, and education will get us out. So I still feel that we have a tremendous responsibility as universities and institutions to make sure that we're being relevant and that we are accessible to the First Nations the most in this country, because we were impacted the most by education, and I think we should be doing more to give back to the nation and nation rebuilding.
So of all the things you're watching, what works the best? Universities have no shortage of options. They can give scholarships. They can set up special programs for teachers or for nurses. They can set up specialized programs in community, deliver the degrees on site. They can do all sorts of stuff. In your experience, what works best?
I think the programs that have been designed by Indigenous people include ones that have a culmination and collaboration between studying on campus in the urban center, but also allowing students to be as close as they can to home, learning from home, doing most of their education from home while doing their degrees at the same time. I think those have proven to be really, really effective because, it's hard to take people away from their community, especially the ones that want to stay in the community, and it's hard to get a commitment from them to carve out 4 years to come and live in an urban center and then move back and expect them to be just as motivated. They might get distracted in between that time. So I think the most successful programs are the ones that have a lot of in community learning and opportunities while also providing space and opportunity for them to do what they need to do to finish their degrees on campus.
So I'm going to run this idea by you. It was an experience and conversation I had with an elder from Northern Ontario. And I was working at the time at the University of Waterloo, which is in Southern Ontario, about 150 kilometers from downtown Toronto. And the university was making a real effort, as they're all trying to do, to sort of serve the Indigenous populations and stuff. So we were sending recruiters up into Northern Ontario and talking to the people up there, saying, come down to this great university. We'll provide you with a great education. And the elder, very kind gentleman, sort of said, some of us view universities kind of like residential schools. And he said, what happens is you come up here and take away our best and brightest. And we have two outcomes. Well, there's three outcomes, he said, but the two dominant outcomes. Number one, they'll go down there and they'll fail, largely because they have difficulties adjusting to the size of the community and the university. You come from a community of 1,000 people and you go to a university that has 30,000 people. That's a huge transition. So they fail out and they come back to us with a sense of being a bit of a loser. Secondly, they succeed. And when they succeed, they tend not to come home at all because they've got a degree in accounting and they've got a degree in education, they've got a degree in social work, and they can get a job down south, and they've often found a partner down south, and so we never see them again, right? The third outcome, sort of extrapolating from his example, is the much smaller number of people who go down south, get an education, and come home again. And overwhelmingly, the stats show this, those people are in education and social work. So the ones who get training as lawyers or get MBAs or do that kind of thing tend not to come home. Does those patterns sound familiar? And essentially, I was really struck by his use of the residential school model because that really gets everybody's nervousness up. I mean, how can you compare a university, which is trying so hard to do a good thing, to residential schools, which was a pretty uniformly bad thing?
Mm-hmm. I think the connection and the affiliation is the act of taking away from the community and then re-educating them to fit into the other world. I think that's the biggest parallel that people feel, especially elders and people that were directly impacted by the residential school system and were there when children were taken away or were the children themselves at the time. So I can totally understand what the elder was talking about, and he's right about those examples, and that is exactly what happens. And you'll have a lot of people that want to leave, and they will leave no matter what. But there are many who want to stay. There's many people that I grew up with who would never imagine living in this city, but they should still have the opportunity to do what they want to do. If they want to be a lawyer, they should be able to do that and stay in the community. And if they want to be police officers, they should be allowed to do that and learn and work in the community. So I totally understand what the elder was
Yeah,
telling you.
but I'm glad you do actually because that his conversation affected me for a long time. I don't know if Canadians know how much the universities are doing in this regard. Nunavut has had a law program which they run from time to time. We have the Northern Ontario School of Medicine, which is now set up in Sudbury and Lakehead, and training people specifically in the north, so they don't have to leave the north, don't have to leave their communities. The universities in Manitoba have been excellent at this. They've got your community, your university does wonderful work in the inner city. I always say this is an odd kind of thing, but you don't think of bachelor's degrees saving lives. And yet there are lots of people in the inner city in Winnipeg who are in tough circumstances. The university's done a great job of subsidizing their tuition fees, getting them access to social assistance and housing, and then giving them a life, a career and a job and all that kind of stuff, that down the line, which is really, really impressive. So we're doing lots of stuff. But the other thing I want to get your thoughts on, because I think it's something you said that's really important. A lot of younger Indigenous people do not want to leave. I'll tell you, people in Southern Canada have trouble believing that. They think everybody wants to live in Toronto, Vancouver, Calgary, and Edmonton. I don't, and perhaps you don't either, obviously. But they have trouble believing that that's actually the point. But many of them are also employed. And you know better than I do that in the communities in northern Manitoba, if you're in Norway House or Oxford House, any of those communities, that if you're a talented high school graduate and you're highly motivated and you've got basic skills of writing and reading and doing mathematics and all that, and you're trainable, the band office, the community, the government's going to hire you. They're going to put you in a job and you're going to get promoted according to your abilities and your skills, but you can still benefit from an education. And so I cannot tell you the number of conversations I've had with government officials who are working for their First Nation, working for their Métis community, working at government, who are saying, I've got 2 kids. I'm making a good salary here. I want to get an education. There's no way I can go away for 3 years or 4 years. It's not going to happen. And so the universities have to adapt and bring that education on site. Do you think universities are very receptive to that model?
Well, I think some are starting to realize that that's a key success outcome that could come out of a situation like that. And we know in northern Manitoba, for example, University College of the North has satellite classrooms in many of the northern communities and even in the interlake ones. And so they know the value of reaching community members and First Nations on reserve. And I think the larger urban centered universities are also realizing that as well. And now we hear about partnerships and collaboration with different institutions on delivering programs there. And I think COVID had a hand in that too. People realized that you had to adapt and be accessible virtually. So that was at least something good that came out of the COVID fiasco. But yeah, no, I think universities are realizing that not everyone wants to come to the urban centers and live on campus and finish their degree that way.
2 things really quickly. I was a board chair member of the First Nations University of Canada. And during COVID, they made a huge effort to get their courses offered online and actually create centers. Many people in a lot of the Indigenous communities, when you have overcrowded houses, people have 10 people living in a house designed for 5. You cannot do school regular online learning when you have people all over the house and lots of noise and background and stuff like that. So they actually set up sort of learning stations in community offices and community centers and things like that. So during COVID, where everybody else was seeing their enrollments decline, First Nations University of Canada actually saw their enrollments go up, and sometimes quite dramatically, which is interesting. But I should also tell you, and I know you're affiliated with University College of the North as well, that it's one of the most impressive institutions with actually serving at the community level. And I was at a recent meeting that you and I were at in Thompson, and a fellow came up to the president of the university and was one of the employees at UCN, and he had just been in one of the communities and had 20 people sign up for a 3-year degree. And they basically agreed to go and study, one course at a time. They were going to do it through the community centers, the satellite centers you've talked about. But the idea there was they built a cohort. And so the obvious answer from a university point is, we'd love to serve the communities. We don't have economies of scale. Well, quite frankly, if you have 20 Indigenous people in a community who can support each other and be part of a cohort going through, it's a pretty powerful model. And it's one that Manitoba has used to a very good effect for years. The Brandon University Northern Teacher Education Program, University of Saskatchewan has a nursing program that's offered on a cohort base in northern Saskatchewan. I mean, it seems to me that at least some universities have figured this out. Why haven't they all figured it out?
Hmm. Great question, and they should. And I think more are. And the example you talked about, the medical doctors I think in Thunder Bay or around
And
there.
Sudbury, yep.
Yeah, they're I think they're also figuring out that is a good strategy to engage, especially First Nations on reserve and other Indigenous folks. It is a worthwhile effort, and I think the more that we see of it, the better, because it's not. The populations are still there. They still also need education, and I think the more flexible we can be, the better. And not only just for the community, but for the world, for the nations, and um, because we need healthy, functioning communities as well to get people in a different level of life. There's a high poverty rates, high illnesses, high even mortality rates are very startling when you think about it. And I think that we can make a difference through education by empowering people with what they need. It's hard to expect people to succeed if we're not going to give them the tools to succeed.
Yeah.
And that's very critical.
Or if we hold the tools in our own backyard and say, if you want them, come down here. We have the solution for it. You got to live in Winnipeg, or you have to live in Saskatoon, or you have to move to Vancouver. It's kind of highly problematic. And one of the things that I love about what you said is that we need to serve the people in the community, but you want to serve them in such a way that they stay in the community long term. And one of the things the Northern Ontario School of Medicine has been absolutely superb at is they select people largely from the north. They train them in the north where their practicums are actually dealing in health centers and all this kind of stuff, wherever they happen to be, and in the smaller communities. And they've discovered that they're staying overwhelmingly. I learned to practice in Kapuskasing, you learn to practice in Hearst, you learn to practice in Kenora. You say, hey, these are nice towns. I can live here. It's a great place. And if you train them in Toronto, or you train them in even in Dalhousie or McGill, they're going to think that in order to be a doctor, you have to be in a major city. So you train people to learn how to be a doctor in these small towns. They've had enormous success with getting the people to actually stay in the area. So we have successful models. Why are we not doing more? Because my view on this is that, we still have a really high dropout rate for Indigenous students who come to university, particularly from the campuses. If they're raised in urban centers and they go to urban high schools, they drop out at a higher rate than non-Aboriginal people, but not that much higher. But if they come from the north, if they come from Norway House, to pick on that lovely community again, and then they move down south, the transition is huge. So are we doing enough to help all those kinds of students?
No, I don't think we are. I think there could be more programs and outreach before they come, and education before they come to the city, to help them see what they could do to start to cope in the transition. I came from my reserve when I was 15 to go to high school here, and I was one of those students that was one of the top students in my class, in my whole school. Education was everything to me. I was super pumped to see the world and to succeed and all of that. And when I started high school here, everything was totally different. I didn't have my parents. I didn't know the streets. I didn't know how to talk to people. I didn't know how to take a bus. Like all these things that you think that people should know, that come from a community that in our own country. But there is a lot of things that are different, and not just the actual physical things, but the transition in our minds too of different community. Where in our small communities, we're very communal. We all help each other as much as we can, and even without trying, we do. But here, everything is so individualistic. It feels like when you get here and compare your life to on reserve, and so you're basically on your own, and you feel like you're fish out of water, and anything could happen to you, and all the dangers too are around, predators and people that are taking advantage of vulnerable people. And then you get into situations where you end up in on the streets. There's a lot of homeless people that are in this situation that were basically, unfortunately, sucked into the bad side of urban living, and it's hard to get out. So there are many things that come into play, and so we can't take it for granted that people would know exactly what to do when they transition from First Nations to urban centers. And we need to do more as institutions to be more welcoming, inclusive, more education, communities as well. We need to do lots of collaboration because they also need to be in the driver's seat on helping people settle in urban centers when they need to.
Well, that's what a great set of observations. And just as a small aside, I was raised in the Yukon. Now, this is 100 years ago before you were born. But I was raised in the Yukon. And we had a whole bunch of our students went from high school down to Whitehorse, and all non-Aboriginal who went down. Most of them went home before the first 8 months. They gave up. And interesting, they were smart kids, really talented people. Why did they give up? Because of the social results. And the universities just assumed that this is normal. You know, you're in a big city, you can go to the rock concerts, you can go to the bars, you can go to movie theaters, you can go to restaurants, spend your money, all that kind of stuff. We came from a small town, about say 15,000 people at the time. And Whitehorse was a much bigger town than the communities you're talking about. You're talking about towns of 800 people, 1,000 people, 1,200 people without road access. And all of a sudden you're in downtown Winnipeg, you know, with all the pressures that go along with that. So that's a really, really important sort of element of getting people prepared and talking openly to them about it. You just don't take for granted the fact they're going to make that positive adaptation. And I think the majority of the kids that came down with me back in the mid-1970s actually went home again really fast. And interesting, and this is one of the things that really worries me, when they go home, they don't look back, they don't tend to look back and say, gee, the university sure let me down. You know, I went there in good faith. I studied really hard to get in. I'm going to make a good faith effort. In the case of Indigenous communities where they have high schools on reserve, those high schools are tracking at least a year or two and sometimes 3 years behind the standards of urban centers. These are smart kids. They know how to study. They know that, like yourself, that as long as you can get past the first year, they do really well. But in universities, always look and say, oh, gee, you couldn't do first year math, so you're out of here. Your dream of being a doctor, throw it all away. And you have to take the time to build that expertise and to build that confidence is really a hard thing to do. Let me ask this: if you, as a student who went to university yourself and now work in one, intellectually, would Indigenous people recognize themselves in a modern Canadian campus? They're being trained by their elders, trained by their parents when they're at home. They come to a university. Now they have experts teaching them things. To what degree would they recognize their history and their culture?
Very little. I think most people feel, I would say, and from my experience, feel inadequate and even dumb and stupid because we didn't have the same information, the same access. When I transitioned from my high school to this one in Winnipeg, I was one of the smartest kids in my class, and then I became one of the dumbest kids in my class, and that was devastating. You know, by October, November, I was looking to my guidance counselor because I was, you know, embarrassed of my marks and I couldn't understand anything. And she tested me at a grade 8 level, and I was supposed to be at a grade 10 level. So when people graduate on reserve and then come straight to post secondary after that, oh my gosh, if there's anyone that ever succeeded, I think that we all need to bow to them and congratulate them because they did a huge thing. But most of us have that hard time with the transition, but also with the actual work load and the type of work and the systems that have been afforded to us and not afforded to us on reserve have a huge impact on the success rate of post-secondary students. And so, yeah, I think most people don't even know that even to this day.
I'm so glad you said it the way you did it, because it's a brilliant summary of sort of the challenges, because the suggestion that you were dumb is ridiculous. The suggestion that you were ill prepared is more accurate. And you'll know from a lot of the Indigenous communities, one of the biggest problems they have is the instability of the teaching workforce. So the teachers are coming and going. So if you go to a high school in Edmonton, if you go to a high school in Toronto or Ottawa, a pretty good chance that the teachers that your older brother and sister had 5-6 years before you are still there. And they see you in grade 8, they see you in grade 12 to get to know who you are. In an isolated northern community, you often have somewhere between like 25, 30 to 80% turnover every year. So there's no continuity of instruction. But what a horrible thing, Sheila. I mean, it really bothers me that you would end up feeling dumb. And and that you adapted obviously very quickly. And the research showed, we did work on this at the University of Saskatchewan, is that if you can get students past the first year, their failure rate and dropout rate is exactly the same as the whole population after in year 2 to 3 and 4. The challenge is that first year, and that first year transition to getting sort of over the hump. Universities, including your university, have made very highly public commitments to integrating Indigenous knowledge into their schools and universities. How are we doing?
Well, it's a good idea and good concept, and more should be done of it. But and even further than just the basic, here at the University of Winnipeg, everyone is expected to have at least one course to teach them about the history and the background of Indigenous folks. And I think sometimes, people welcome it. Some newcomers don't understand, but they just do it anyway. But there are people who resent it and say, "Why should I have to learn this? It's fluff and things I don't need." And you hear it, you sense it. But I think to combat that, we need more of it, because obviously they don't understand why it's important, and we need actually even more of it, including incorporating Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous ways of knowing into the course curriculums, not just the ones that are connected to Indigenous issues, but science, kinesiology, all these different departments, English, they all should have some Indigenous content in every department, so people not only get comfortable with the fact that we're here and we've always been here, but also the fact that they should know their own history in their own country of what happened to the original people of these lands, and incorporate it into their professional lives that they're going to be, going into, because they're going to meet Indigenous people no matter what field they're going to get into, and they should know the background and they should know the history, so they don't make mistakes that we've seen in the past. And even in recent months, there's racism being called out in every facet of society, and it's because we all learned to be ignorant to Indigenous people.
Yeah, learn to be ignorant. What a terrible way, but beautiful way of putting it. We have learned to be ignorant in many ways. The thing that always surprises me and disappoints me, Sheila, that at the end of this is that the knowledge, Indigenous people are still willing to share their knowledge. There's certain sacred things that aren't to be shared. Though those are things designed for the community, and they have controlled by individuals and families and communities. I completely respect that. But the thing that astonishes me, after all the hardship we put First Nations through in Canada, that they're truly interested in sharing their knowledge. I don't ever remember having an elder sort of say, "I'm not going to come to your class and talk to you," or "I don't want to talk to those non-Aboriginal students," or they should go to their own university. Don't get to come and talk to me. They're actually really eager to share, the insights that they have, and I don't know why people feel threatened by that. You're not saying that this is the only way to see the world. I've never heard an elder say, "You must study my way or you're dumb." They say, "No, here, listen, I'm going to tell you how our spirituality works, or how we understand the land, or how we understand the cycles of fishing, or the way in which moose move on the land. We'll tell you that material. You then integrate it with your other knowledge, and maybe we'll learn from each other." And it seems to me, I thought, I got involved in this university administration in the early 1990s, and I thought we were on top of that back then and getting really excited about it. We actually haven't moved that far in that regard. And, we're still very reluctant. It's sort of the idea that if you somehow learn more about Aboriginal people, you're somehow learning less knowledge, when in fact it's way better knowledge and more comprehensive.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so
Environmentalism is showing us that we should have been listening to Indigenous people all along, and we wouldn't be in this crazy mess of the environment and the weird weather patterns we're seeing all over. And I think that is just one example of an area that, if we had listened to Indigenous people all these years, then we would have been better off now.
well, and I hope we'll get there. I've sort of asked you for your last comment. This has been a wonderful conversation, Sheila. I appreciate you very much being with us. Is that how optimistic are you that we'll actually turn this around, and that we'll actually become successful at involving Aboriginal people in the way they wish to be involved, and serving Indigenous communities in the way they wish to be involved? I mean, what I worry about is right now with big budget cuts happening, at a lot of universities, including your own. They're laying people off. They're closing down programs. That's the ultimate test on whether we've actually internalized a commitment. So when we start slashing programs, if the First Nations programs, the Métis Inuit programs are on that list, then that showed you they never were very central. And I worry right now, because I think the next 2 or 3 years are going to be very financially tough, that last in, first out, we've only been doing these things for a while, that they'll be the first things we'll cut. We'll go back to the core. So how optimistic are you that we can maintain a positive trajectory and get more Indigenous students involved, integrate them more successfully in a positive way, not assimilate, make sure that they participate, and support their success and their aspirations? Those are completely reasonable things for Aboriginal people to have. The desire to have the educational opportunities the rest take for granted. Are you optimistic about this, or are you pessimistic, or where do you fit on that scale?
Well, I two things give me hope. My grandbaby and all of our grandbabies. I think there's a different generation just behind us, even in high school and elementary students who are learning differently than we have for many generations, and they're more caring and more inclusive. And some people might call them woke. I don't know, but I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing, because I think that they understand the world better than we did when we were young people. And so that gives me hope that we're empowering our young people to stand up for themselves, to stand up for what is right, and to educate them to show that we can't be discriminating against people that we don't necessarily agree with. And we see that a lot more. I see presentations like that by young people and movements. But also, a chief once told me, 150 years ago, 150 plus years ago, Indigenous people were meant to be extinct. But here we are. We're still here. We're in every facet of society. We've come along through many different hard, difficult times, but we're still here, and we're now understanding the systems. We're understanding better, and we're figuring it out, and we're finding ways to immerse ourselves and take up space. 150 years later, where will we be if we keep going towards this, this pattern and this mentality? And so I do have a lot of hope, but I am a little bit of an eternal optimist.
Well, and you're also a seven generations thinker, right? Non-Aboriginal people like myself sort of work on political cycles. What can we do in the next 3 years? You're sitting here talking about 150 years and thinking, well, the trajectory might be bumpy. It isn't always straight up. It's always a bit up and down, but it's obviously getting an awful lot better. Let me end with my comments, and we'll give you a last chance to say the last word. Is that I've been involved in universities now. I went to university in 1974. That's a long, long time ago. And at that time, you could rarely find a course on Indigenous people outside an anthropology department. So they were studying them as objects of, Indigenous culture, ethnography, that sort of thing. But now it's pervasive. You have Aboriginal issues in law, and you have it in education, you have it in healthcare, you have it in other sort of fields as well. And Indigenous folks have enriched the university system in many, many dramatic ways. I think the university system has contributed in reverse, but nowhere near as much as we should have. We got a lot of money from government, a lot of money from taxpayers to actually do the good work that we're expected to do. I think we've been a little bit slow. And my view basically is that the university system should pay more attention to the University of Winnipeg as an urban example, to the University College of the North as a northern example, to First Nations University of Canada as an Indigenous controlled institution, of which there are 25 or 30 in the country now, many of them offering degrees. In other words, we've done the system has changed. We haven't noticed it because it wasn't about us being non-Aboriginal people. But we've got a much stronger, robust approach to Indigenous people to post-secondary education. So, Sheila, your comments have been just fantastic. Thank you very, very much. I'll give you the last word. You say you're optimistic. What do you need the university system to do to prove that they're deserving of your optimism?
Well, I think public and the government, and ultimately it's the public that turns the head of government, needs to support the idea of supporting with more and greater resources for Indigenous people that want to go to school. For example, when people from my community want to go to a program, a university post-secondary program, they can apply, but they don't necessarily get to go because there's not enough resources for everyone who wants to go to go, but we should have, make it accessible for everyone who wants to learn. And that of course means commitment and more resources. And, the public can help with that by pushing their governments to make those big, bold changes.
I just have to add to something because what you said is so profound. Just to use a tiny example, Sheila, of the problem that we're having is that many First Nations they have to ration the time. And you've got 100 people who want to get a post-secondary education. You've got funding for 22. So you actually have to make a really, really difficult choice, and they are excruciatingly hard choices. Many of the communities are saying, we're going to fund you for either 3 or 4 years. And after that, you're on your own. There's no family money. There's no parents and grandparents or others who are there to back it up, right? I've had this conversation with communities many, many times and saying, you realize the average student takes 5.5 years to finish a 4-year degree. That 4 years is not, you probably did it in 4 years, but that's an exceptional time. And very often they're doing it as single moms.
And you're living in abject poverty.
Absolutely.
It's,
Absolutely.
hard.
Absolutely. And we're sitting going, well, you got your 4 years of funding. A number of non-Aboriginal students say, oh, it's so unfair. They get education for free. Oh, that's such nonsense. So, in other words, Sheila, we've got work to do, big issues to sort of address. And as long as we have people like you near the powerful seats, I think we're going to make some real progress. So, Sheila North, thank you very, very much on behalf of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and our audience who's really interested in the transitions facing the university system. I couldn't thank you more. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I guess I get an ask them